Now, the last thing that I want to go over is how to get the zone capabilities that we had in instrument and effect racks within a drum rack. So before I showed you that you can change this simpler that it loads as stock to a sampler, which we have already done in this first channel. Here I'll do it again in this second channel. Here we have a simpler, we'll load it into a sampler, and within our sampler we have this zone option. And you can see here we have key zones, velocity zones, and the zone selector option that we had in our instrument racks. So this may be one reason why you decide to use a sampler over an actual simpler. And a cool trick that we can actually use by utilizing the chain selector mode is that we can actually load multiple samples into a single sampler and then cycle between them using this chain selector option here. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. We're going to select our first channel and delete all these other samples that we have loaded. So we can simply click a cell and press the delete key on our keyboard, and that chain and its corresponding sample will be deleted from the rack. So here we are back to our original chain, and we're going to go ahead and select the zone chain selector option. Now what we can do is go into the browser and we can actually load new samples into this sampler instrument. So I mentioned that we have 128 different options to choose from. So in essence, we can load up to 128 different drum samples. So I'm going to be loading all kicks in this, and I will show you why in just a moment. But for now, let's go ahead and go to my kick folder within my user library, and I'll select all the kicks I have here. Now this isn't 128, but this is just for example. So now that I've clicked and dragged all my different samples into the actual sampler, what we can go ahead and do is right click within the zone range and distribute these ranges equally. So now each individual chain takes up its own space or its own range for this zone selector to choose from. So as we change this zone selector, we are actually changing the sample or the kick drum that is played back. So right now we are playing this plugger kick. If we change the zone selector into this range here, we'll be playing our first and original kick. Now another cool trick that we can do is actually right click on this zone selector and we can map this function to macro 1. So now listen in as we trigger this actual kick drum and change the sample that is selected. So very quickly, we can cycle through all of our favorite samples and choose the one that best suits the track for us. So the main idea of this is that we can build up a really epic drum kit that we can use in basically all of our projects, because it harbors all of the samples that we would end up using, and by simply adjusting these macros or these sample selectors, we can choose the specific samples that we want in that specific track. So let's go ahead and rename this macro to kick, and I'll show you one more time how I would go about doing this with a snare drum. So here's our snare folder. We'll go ahead and load this up to this cell here, and we will right click on the simpler, change it into a sampler, go into the zones, make sure we have the selector option available so that we can actually click and drag this range, and then we'll go ahead and load the rest of these samples. We'll right click in the range section and we will choose to distribute all of the ranges equally. And I actually missed that first range, so we'll go ahead and do that one more time. And now the last step, we'll go ahead and map this chain selector to macro 2. So now we have a kick drum as well as a snare drum that we can very quickly change the sound to with all of our favorite samples already loaded onto the clip. So instead of using the browser to go through our samples We can instead already have them loaded into a drum rack and simply select them by turning a knob. So using drum racks in this way is really awesome, and I highly recommend you build your own drum kit with all of your favorite samples and take the time to individually select 128 usable sounds so that you really never have to go searching in your browser for drum samples again.